Hello, everyone. We just wanted to take this time to welcome Mark Gill. He is very gracious to join us here today to talk about Great Lakes ice and what's involved in the forecast that the National Weather Service Cleveland issues and how they use that information and what they do with it as well. He is the director of vessel traffic for services for the St. Mary's River in the Sault Ste. Marie area. So, Mark, could you fill in a little bit more detail what your job entails and more about yourself?
Thanks, Kirk. Greetings to everyone. As Kirk indicated, my name is Mark Gill, and by title, I am the Director of Vessel Traffic Services, working out of the U.S. Coast Guard sector offices in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. Primary responsibility is the safe and efficient movement of commercial traffic that plies the St. Mary's River, which connects Lake Huron to Lake Superior. During the winter months, my office plans and executes the domestic icebreaking activities for western Great Lakes. So that's the northern half of Lake Huron, all of Lake Michigan, and then all of Lake Superior. We do that in partnership, and later on in the presentation, we'll talk about the domestic icebreaking organization, how those resources are dispatched. Myself, my background, I am a 40-year employee of the U.S. Coast Guard. 21 years of that was active duty service. I sailed on a number of ships, was an electronics technician, actually a sonar electronics technician earlier in my career, transitioned to the officer ranks where I became a ship driver, and that's kind of how I landed in the Great Lakes, where I drove a buoy tender and an icebreaker here in the Great Lakes before retiring in the early 2000s. I failed retirement, came back to work as a civil servant, and I've been with the Coast Guard. This will be my 20th year as a civilian employee of the U.S. Coast Guard government service, and again, based here out of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan.
Okay, great. That's great to hear. I just wanted to fill in our viewers who I am. I work for the National Weather Service here in Cleveland as a meteorologist, and my name is Kirk Lombardi as well. So it's great to have you. So we'll go ahead and get started on our little interview here. First of all, my first question I had for you is, could you pretty much give us an explanation behind the history of icebreaking across the Great Lakes?
So here on the Great Lakes, actually, commercial shipping has driven the mission. There have been mariners plying the waters of the Great Lakes for centuries. And I'll kind of limit my history lesson here to the late 1900s and early 2000s time frame, just for time management purposes. But here in the last, I'd say 50 or 60 years, we've been kind of pressing Mother Nature to try and get more and more out of our waterway, even despite the onset of ice. Back in the 50s, 60s, and even early 70s, the mariners were forced to stop navigation when ice began to come on. In the early 1930s, 1936 specifically, the president at that time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, issued an executive order to the U.S. Coast Guard, which said, we want you to take these Navy tugs and we want you to break ice on the Great Lakes. And the three reasons for that were to protect the environment, to safeguard island communities, and then to meet the reasonable demands of commerce. So in the late 30s, early 40s, the Coast Guard took this Navy equipment, and we did our best to try and formulate a movement on the Great Lakes. Mother Nature obviously drives that mandate. In the early 30s, 40s, and 50s, our capabilities were far less than what we currently have. There was no Mackinac, there was no ice-breaking fleet. It was just a series of tugs, and basically we pushed boats around to try and get them around the Great Lakes in order to get those last loads. And a lot of times that was late October, early November. In milder years, we got into December, but for the most part, the Great Lakes would close when the significant ice would form, and then we would try and open again in the late spring, April, May timeframe. And again, these assets weren't very powerful. They weren't very coordinated. and our communications, which is really important these days, our communications was weak. We were often line of sight, which meant, at best 5-7 miles. Now we have a network of online and satellite communications that allow us to direct icebreaking activities all the way across the Great Lakes. So that's kind of the early history. As we got into the 70s, commercial shipping, their vessels got stronger. The Coast Guard got a fleet of tugs that were very capable for the time period. And there was a challenge to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to try and keep the Soo locks open to allow year-round commercial navigation. The big cargo of the time was iron ore. We were trying to get iron ore from the mines in Lake Superior, western Lake Superior, specifically Minnesota and the Mesabi ore mines. We wanted that cargo down to Lake Michigan's iron ore plants, Detroit refineries, Cleveland, Toledo, even on the Canadian side, Toronto and Nanticoke are refineries. This iron ore was delivered to make steel products. At that time in the early 70s, a lot of it had to do with automobiles. Now that economy or that iron ore trade is kind of changed a bit, and we can speak to that when we talk about finances here later on. So I brought you to the 70s. There was a year-round navigation experiment, 1974 to 1978. And what we learned from that was that operating in ice year-round is dangerous. It's unpredictable. It's hard on our equipment, not only on the ships, not only on the icebreakers, but also on the infrastructure. The locks specifically were challenged almost on an annual basis. When those temperatures get down into the 0 degree Fahrenheit, hydraulics, whether it be water-based or hydraulic fluid-based, they typically have a hard time operating.
Sure.
Cables, wire rope, these things don't work well in sub-freezing temperatures. And so what we found out basically was, hey, we really do need to take some downtime.
Okay.
And so that's kind of how we've evolved. Out of that, we came with a seasonal aspect to the Great Lakes. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers established a 300-day navigation season. They established a fixed period to conduct winter maintenance on the locks. We're going to talk about winter maintenance here in a minute. But at the same time, those fixed dates of closure became 16 January to 24 March. And so seasonally, anything that we got in late December before the locks closed in January, we titled the extended navigation season. It was extra. Any navigation that was done while the locks were closed, we closed the closed navigation season. And then in the spring, after the locks open, until ice isn't a hindrance to navigation anymore, we call that the spring breakout season. And it's this seasonality, the cargoes that are moved and the various aspects of that contribute to winter navigation. It's why the National Weather Service does what they do. Other agencies such as NOAA, the Canadian Ice Service, the Environment Canada, the National Ice Center for the United States, the North American Ice Center, the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory. I'm sure I'm going to miss somebody on that list, but all of these entities plus the U.S. Coast Guard come together, partner, we predict, we anticipate, and then we execute on behalf of the commercial industry that's serving the Great Lakes.
Right. Well, that's wonderful to hear all of that history. I mean, I've learned a lot already myself as well. So, obviously, we're here for the weather. And one of the questions one of our viewers asked is, where do you obtain this weather information? Where do you get it from?
So I was running down that list of government entities. We rely very heavily on the work that is done not only out of the National Weather Service office in Cleveland, Gaylord, Marquette. We rely very heavily on the ice services. We have the North American Ice Service, which is a partner group, the Canadian Ice Service and the National Ice Center combined to create that one entity. and then NOAA, and then the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory. Their access to satellite imagery, photo imagery, and then the ice reports that come from the various entities. Um, these folks, and their predictions and their products are used not only by us but our Canadian Coast Guard partners, and then we provide information to the commercial mariner so that they can make rational, safe decisions with regards to the movement of their ships and their cargoes.
Right, right. Okay, that's great to hear. Back in 2015, unfortunately there were 18 ships, as far as I remember, that actually became stuck in the ice. From your perspective, what did you, or how did you handle this, or what happened during that event?
So year to year, it's interesting. We say if you've seen one winter, you've seen one winter. And so it's interesting you brought up the 2015 winter. Every year brings with it a certain set of challenges. The year previous to that, the 2014 season, 2013-14, is kind of what we call a generational event. We saw more ice from a percentage of coverage and from a thickness standpoint across the Great Lakes than we had seen in 35 plus years. The following season, we were supposed to catch a break. And we actually did in the early part of the season. It was milder. The December 2014 into January 2015, we were fairly mild. But Arctic blast, cold air, February, early March, kind of gave us an expansive coverage of ice. And going into the spring, we had more ice than we had icebreakers. But interestingly, the latter part of March, we had a significant thaw. Our temperatures elevated well above seasonal norms. And we had about a 10-day period where we saw a rapid deterioration of ice, not only in the river sectors, but up on Lake Superior. And so with strong westerly winds, this newly deteriorated ice that would formed out in the open water lakes pushed east and descended upon Whitefish Bay. Whitefish Bay itself, if you kind of think of the orientation of Lake Superior, and crudely it kind of is oblong shaped with a west to east orientation. Whitefish Bay has a northeast to southeast orientation, and we kind of consider Whitefish Bay the bathtub or the drain of the Lake Superior bathtub. It's where all the water ends up. And when Whitefish Bay is full of ice, imagine a bathtub with a clogged drain. And so in 2015, that spring, what happened after a significant wind event, all of that ice that had deteriorated in Lake Superior came crashing down on Whitefish Bay. And the sustained winds piled that ice at the northwest end of Whitefish Bay. And where we had plate ice inside the bay that was roughly 3 feet thick, out to Whitefish Point and beyond, we had a 10-mile by 30-mile collection of ice that was 35 plus feet thick.
Oh my.
There were chunks of ice in that were described as pickup truck sized.
Oh, wow.
So if you can kind of imagine that from scale. And so as Kirk indicated, over a period of about 7 days, we had 18 ships collect. They were all upbounders. So on the northwest side of this block of ice, we had 8 ships that wanted to come down towards the locks, and then you had 18 ships that were trapped on the southeast side of that block of ice. And so there was our challenge. We had the Canadian Coast Guard ship Samuel Risley that was on the outside. Mackinac, unfortunately, was not available to us at this time. She was in the lower river working. So we had the Coast Guard cutter Alder working on the inside. And so while Risley chipped away at the ice on the west end, the Alder chipped away and established tracks on the east end. And it took us a day and a half to get that organized. We kind of described it as kind of having a 2-lane highway, and you had a bridge that connects the lanes in each direction, and the bridge was out. and it took us a day and a half to reconnect that bridge. So the winds relented. That allowed us to start chipping it away at the ice. And as that ice kind of relaxed, the pressure and the thickness kind of abated, and eventually we restored movement.
Okay, that's great. Normally, when we at the National Weather Service see these events developing, typically we will go ahead and issue what we call an ice advisory, and this alerts all of the users, your ship masters and people like yourself, that there's potential that these ice flows can start shifting and obviously cause entrapment. So we try to give our best to give a little bit of a heads up when these cases do develop. So thank you for
Another
that.
key advisory that you issue is ice pressure warnings. Those are very important. So when we have wind events and vessels are going to be traversing various fields of ice, these ice or pressure warnings are issued, and that lets the ships know that ice fields that they're going to be traversing are going to be under pressure. Think of a vice, but a vice that moves very quickly. Mm-hmm. And where you have solid fields of ice that are connected to the shoreline, under pressure of wind, the ice that is free to move will move and often will collapse, and then can pressure and actually trap ships and actually move them so that the ship can't free itself. And that creates dangerous situations for the ship and the icebreaker that has to go in and rescue them.
Oh yeah, sure. I've seen cases on our satellite where we've had ships actually trapped in the ice. There was a case up in Lake Huron where the ship just drifted right along with the whole ice flow because they obviously couldn't move. So it's great to have the icebreakers out there to help get them free and get them moving again. So. So how much, we were talking about finances earlier, but how much money are we talking about in the Great Lakes, on an annual basis or so, as far as our commerce? The Great Lakes is a huge boon for our country and even for Canada to move goods and services into the interior parts of our country.
Sure. So we'll begin with the economic significance of Great Lakes commerce. So through the locks, which is essentially representative of the entire Great Lakes system, we average between $3 and $4 billion worth of commodities on an annual basis. Now, when you add in the Canadian commercial activity, that probably adds another $1.5 to $2 billion. We'll keep that separate for now, and we'll just talk about national significance. That amount of money equates to about 3% of the country's GDP. Most of the cargo that's moving here is not high impact cargo. We're talking about really rocks, iron ore, rocks, limestone, rocks, coal, rocks, grain. Even though it's not rocks, it is bulk cargo. And so these things, they're not really high dollars. Iron ore trades roughly $35 to $40 a ton. That it just doesn't resonate. I formerly worked the Port of Houston. It's the largest petrochemical port in the country. You close that waterway down for 12 hours, and the commodities market in Chicago and the stock market, after a 24-hour period, they will actually start to feel the impact of that closure. When the chemicals and the fuel oils and the various additives stop moving, the nation's fuel supply is impacted, and therefore those related commercial markets will see some negative activity. You stop for a day, 3 days, a week, commerce through the Soo Locks or across the Great Lakes, it's just not going to impact the commodities market the same way. Where it has a larger impact and where the significance is for us more is what we call the regional economy. There are 8 states that are basically reliant on the Great Lakes. They're the eight United States that ring the lakes. You have 2 provinces of Canada, Ontario and Quebec, that are reliant on Great Lakes trade. 55% of those regional economies are dependent on the year-round commercial navigation here on the Great Lakes. That means folks that go to the steel facilities, the companies that service those employees, the engineers, the commercial folks on the boats, the trucks, the trains, all the intermodal systems that are tied to the Great Lakes are fed off of that on an annual basis. So when you close the locks down for a day or two, not a significant impact. But when you start to get 4 or 5 days of closure or 4 or 5 days of delay, that's when you start to impact regional economy. That's a big deal for us. Jobs lost, hours lost, things like that. We can get into the various enterprises, the various facilities that are impacted, iron ore and the trade there. I don't want to get too far down in the weeds, but what I want to say is that there's a great impact and there's a great demand for the products, not just on a national level, but here on a regional level, even to that local level as well.
Okay. Yeah, it just seems like I mentioned earlier, that we're an important part of our country's finances. So it's great to hear that we're all playing a part in making sure that this all continues to transpire through the year. So
one of the keys to what we do, and this is, and I say we collectively, right? Because what you do down in Cleveland in your office, or what NOAA does in their offices, or what the Canadian Ice Service, or any Environment Canada, any of these entities, this is a collective effort to provide for the safe and efficient movement of commerce, right? It's a big, giant system. Yeah, we have flag states, you have Canadians, and you have US, and you have US economy, and you have Canadian economy, and there are separate and dividers amongst those things. But when it comes to intermodal movement, right, we don't see flag state. We treat the Great Lakes as one big giant port or one big giant waterway.
right,
And there are segments, and there's higher priorities placed on segment based on movement, based on cargo types, things like that. And we'll certainly break those down at some point here in this conversation. But what I want to be able to tell you is that we treat movement on its own merit, right? And it's all about efficiency, predictability. You go back to the history we were talking about earlier. 30, 40 years ago, ice and weather drove. We didn't have the broadcasts and the forecasting systems that we have now. 1975, November 10th, Edmund Fitzgerald sinking, right? One of the big things that came out of that accident was the development of forecasting, right?
right,
We didn't have ready response assets, the U.S. Coast Guard. So we didn't have anybody in what we call an alert situation. It took us almost 24 hours to crew a vessel to go out and start looking. And it's because at the time, we just didn't have those risk management entities involved in our planning process. And so, unfortunately, with accidents, we seem to learn and adjust our behavior. We like to be what we call preventative in my world of work. We want to be forward looking, evaluate risk, and then make decisions to avoid danger. But at the same time, we don't, we like to say we control many things. The weather and the environment is not one of them.
No,
We don't
no.
get to have that control. So we can guess. We're better at guessing, right? Our 3 to 5 day outlook has improved demonstrably over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. And we're getting better, so much better that our 30, 60, and 90 day outlooks
Right.
are what used to be basically guesses, a shot in the dark.
Sure.
Now we've got some predictability, the modeling that you guys do. That's the kind of benefits that we've come over here. So predictability, we want to be able to explain to the mariner what's out there, the dangers and the delays that they're likely to incur, so that they can make the risk management decisions that they need to do to provide the safety of the crew and the vessel and the cargo and eventually the environment, all the things that are factored into that stuff.
Right, right. You mentioned the forecasting aspect of it, and because of the Fitzgerald, we at the National Weather Service Cleveland back then they developed a actual Marine program where they brought NOAA Corps officers into the office, and they were focused, dedicated on marine forecasting. And from that, it's been paired out through all these different offices within the Great Lakes, and now with communications, we're able to get these forecasts out fairly rapidly compared to the past. So it's been a huge change over the years with modernization, better technology as well. So
And with time, we learn, right?
yes,
So we have
exactly.
more data. That's the kind of the debate around climate right now. I'll go out to the public and they'll ask me questions about my feelings on climate change. Largely agnostic about climate change. One, I'm not a meteorologist or a scientist, but two, it's just in my world of work, there's just not a lot of data. I tell folks the world's millions of years old, but we've got basically, maybe 200 years of temperature data, and we only have about 40 or 50 years of water level data, water temperature data, and ice coverage data. So you put that in scale, we really don't know a whole lot. And so people say, hey, what are these conditions setting up for, and what do you think for the weather? You've seen one winter, because
Yeah.
they're all different.
You hit the nail right on the head because a lot of people think that, oh, hey, it's the water temperatures are warm, and they think, oh, we're going to have a lot of lake effect snow. Well, all it takes is a couple major storms moving through the Great Lakes, and it brings the water temperatures down fairly quickly. So they can all change in a matter of a month's time or so. So the one predictor may not always be the case for every case. So, but moving on here, we've got, let's see, where do you see the most significant ice impacts on the Great Lakes when we do develop the ice?
So that's interesting. So each lake has its own unique characteristics. Lake Ontario, once the Welland Canal closes, the St. Lawrence Seaway closes, we really don't pay a whole lot of attention to Lake Ontario. It sits from an elevation standpoint a little lower than the other lakes, and so weather has a tendency to kind of pass over it. It's a little warmer, so they don't get the coverage, but because the locks on either end of that are closed, there's really not a lot of commercial activity, so we kind of don't pay attention to it during the larger periods of ice cover. Lake Erie, very shallow, right? So the west end freezes up, and then you'll start to see ice, and it's not uncommon for it to have, more than 75% of coverage of ice every year, just because it is so shallow and it's so immediately affected by weather. You can have very rough seas and then change of wind, and within 6-8 hours, it'll sit right back down and be flat as a pancake. And then you can see the wind shift and then develop, and it'll have significant seas in an opposite direction within less than a half a day. So it's different transition. We include Lake St. Clair in our conversations. I know it's not one of the Great Lakes, but it does connect the Detroit River to the St. Clair River and a passage from Lake Erie to Lake Huron. Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, kind of similar, where you have long north to south lengths, deep water, but sheltered on either side by larger land masses. So they behave a little bit differently. And then when you look at the big lake, Lake Superior, and you kind of look at its orientation east-west, it is the largest of the Great Lakes. It's the deepest of the Great Lakes, and it's kind of you'll kind of hopefully agree with me here. Maybe you'll counter me, but we kind of think that Lake Superior is the Great Lakes weather maker.
Yeah.
She has such an influence on everything that happens in the Great Lakes.
Sure.
And so her behavior, that lake's behavior, its water depth, its relationship to chart datum or normal water levels, high or low, impact what happens in the lower lakes. Its temperature, like you mentioned before, a couple degrees shift in one direction or the other, and you'll have a completely different weather event as was forecasted, because any one of a number of variables changes, and then that lake doesn't behave the way we think it will, and then everything's off. So from transitional or challenging ice conditions, I hate to pin one area over the other. I'll tell you, they each present different challenges.
Okay.
What we've done over time is we've created what we call waterway classifications. And rather than define difficulty, we have defined various waterways based on their use. So I'll use an analogy. Think of it this way for snow removal. If you're going to travel in the wintertime, you come out of your house, you use your driveway, you get on a side street, you get to a county road, and then you go to the interstate, right? For snow removal, there's no expectation that the state's plow truck is going to come into your driveway and plow you. Very rarely, unless it's an emergency, you're going to ever see the state plow truck come into a county road or a side street. Generally speaking, the driveway is going to be you, the homeowner, or you, if you live in an apartment, the association or the apartment owner. But privately, you're going to manage that. Your side street may be a homeowners association or a community organization, or maybe you have a city, like a township or a city mayor's organization that's going to maintain that. County takes care of the county, and the state with the big vehicles takes care of the interstate. Well, here on the Great Lakes, we've divided the various waterways similar to that. So when you leave a dock, that dock is what we classify Tier 4. It's wholly private. The dock owner, the facility, or the manager of that facility generally is going to take care of the conditions in that particular area. So if I'm a ship and I'm coming to your facility in Cleveland, I'm going to expect, remember, predictability is the key. I'm going to expect that you've cleared that up so that I can arrive.
Right.
The channel or the waterway that gets me to you, we've broken that up into 3 other subsections. Tier 3, that's the federal channel that the U.S. Coast Guard marks with buoys and lights. So as I come from the open lake and I enter the harbor of Cleveland, there's lights and buoys that help guide me, the mariner, into that waterway. The Coast Guard is obligated by law to light and set a path to those waterways. We find where safe water is. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has a role there because they actually maintain the bottom, the channel bottom, but we maintain the water column in between. And so we will lay out a street with street signs and lamps and how to behave there, right?
Right, right.
Open water of the lakes. Lake Erie sometimes will always clear out, will always freeze over. So any ice-covered open water areas that are in a lake or not part of a particular port, we call Tier 2 waterways.
Okay.
And then finally, the connecting waterways of the Great Lakes. So think of this. To get from Lake Erie to Lake Huron, you have to use the Detroit-St. Clair River system. To get from Lake Huron to Lake Michigan, you got to use the Straits of Mackinac. To get from Lake Huron to Lake Superior, you use the St. Mary's River. These waterways are the interstates of the Great Lakes.
Right.
These have our highest classification, and we call these Tier 1. So as I transit the Great Lakes, I'm a commercial ship. If I leave the port of Duluth, I exit a Tier 4 facility, I go through a Tier 3 waterway, I get out into the Tier 2 of the open lake, and then when I reach the St. Mary's River, I'm in a Tier 1. This waterway classification helps the mariner define what services they are obliged to provide for themselves or hire, and where they can expect government support. Think of that highway system, right? Where can I expect the state plow truck to be? It's not going to be in my driveway. It's going to be out on that interstate. Mm-hmm. And so typically the government resources, the U.S. and Canadian big icebreakers, they're going to be out in those connecting waterways. As we get to the Tier 2s and Tier 3s, the government has an obligation to set a path and then periodically visit that path so that we make sure that it's safe, right? So that's us conducting a track and then maintaining that track through the ice in those waterways.
Right.
And then when you get to the Tier 4, that's wholly private unless there's an emergency, right? County plow truck, if you've got an emergency in your house and they can't get to you because you got 6 feet of snow in your driveway,
right,
they'll bring a plow in there. You may not like the way they bring the plow in there,
mm-hmm,
but they're going to bring a plow in there.
Yeah.
So for emergencies, in that Tier 4, you may see some government service, but for the most part, that's the homeowner or the facility owner's
right,
management of that.
Okay.
And so that's how we define waterway in the Great Lakes. When it goes to difficulty, look, every one of those from Tier 4 to Tier 1 can have some challenges. How we use our resources between the U.S. and the Canadian governments, that goes to the rules and regulations that we've set up in our policy and procedures in partnership with the commercial shipping industry.
Right, right. It's interesting you use the analogy of using our roadways because that helps people to understand better what you're talking about. So thank you for doing that.
The oceans, the waters, they are the highways of the shipping industry.
Sure.
And so the analogy seems to work. And people can certainly here in the Midwest, we can all understand about snow removal.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
you're either out there shoveling it yourself or blowing it or hiring somebody to come in. And the
Right.
same thing goes true for industry.
Sure. Now, when we do see a lot of ice on the Great Lakes, what percentage drop, or like how many ships do you think are out there during that time? I mean, do a lot of them harbor up for the winter, or do they try to go as long as they can?
So you remember earlier we talked about the seasonality of the Great Lakes, right? The lock systems, the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Welland Canal, and the Soo locks are all built on a schedule. And we provide a basic 300-day navigation season.
Okay.
The St. Lawrence Seaway and the Welland Canal, their shutdown schedule is a little bit more fluid, than the Soo locks managed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Soo locks has a fixed time period for closing. The St. Lawrence Seaway and the Welland Canal typically close around the Christmas time frame. Usually have plus or minus 4 or 5 days built around that. If weather supports them staying open a little longer, they'll try and stay open. But generally speaking, plus or minus a week on the Christmas Day holiday is when they're looking to close. That means all your foreign flag ships that are trading on the Great Lakes, if they're planning on leaving, they got to get out. Otherwise, they're going to be wintered in for the season. That costs money, and so that also prevents them from trading on the world stage. So a lot of those foreign flag ships leave. A lot of the U.S. and the Canadian companies, they're lake-bound. They're built larger than those locks can handle. And so from a size standpoint, they are what we call lake-bound or lakers. Those vessels stay in the lakes.
Okay.
Now, if you think of the seasonality of that shipping season, generally ice begins to form in western Lake Superior around 15 December. And it typically begins to abate around 15 April. Now, weather dictates, sometimes it's early, sometimes it's late. We've started ice breaking as early in history, as early as the first week of December, and we've broken ice as late as Father's Day weekend. Hopefully we don't have that this year, but it's again, you've seen one winter, you've seen one winter.
Right.
You have generational events, we have average winners, we have below average winners, and then we have above average winners.
Sure.
And so that's kind of that seasonality of that. But think about this, right? On any given day, when the locks are open during periods of ice cover, right? So that's end of December, 1st of January, end of March, 1st of April. On any given day during those periods, there's roughly 70 vessels on the Great Lakes that are at some form of commerce.
Okay.
And every one of those are asking for icebreaking assistance. At some way or shape or form, they're asking for an icebreaker. Between the U.S. government and the Canadian government here on the Great Lakes, we have 11 icebreaking resources. The Canadian Coast Guard brings 2, what we call heavy icebreakers. The U.S. Coast Guard brings 1 heavy, which is the Coast Guard cutter Mackinac. We have 2 medium-size ice-capable vessels. That's our 2 buoy tenders. And then we have 6 icebreaking tugs, medium-sized icebreakers. So between the U.S. and the Canadian government, we have 11.
Okay.
Now what that means is if 70 people or 70 vessels are asking for help and we only have 11 icebreakers, not everybody gets an icebreaker when they want one. And so over the course of time, we have developed what we call a priority of service. And so think of it this way. When you walk into DMV and you see a crowd of people and you're trying to figure out where am I in line for the next person to get called up, there's always that little dash of self-confusion. When you look in and you see a bunch of people in the room and you wonder where you're at. Over time, they have figured out that they've come up with a number system where you take a number when you walk in the door and then you look up on the sign and it says now serving number 7. And you look down and you see you're 12 and you have a reasonable understanding of where you fall in line.
Right.
Well, for commercial shipping, we have developed a take a number process.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's not exactly take a number, but it's given a place in line based on where they're located and the urgency of their request. Now, you remember history told us that when we first started ice breaking, the government said by executive order, we want you to break ice, protect the environment, to safeguard island communities, and to meet the reasonable demands of commerce. And so these priorities of service harken back to that original executive order, except that, say you're a mariner and you want to take your ship out, and I'm a mariner and I want to take my ship out. Your request is every bit as reasonable as mine, but we can't be serviced at the same time.
Right.
And so one of us may have to wait. Now, sometimes we can put us both together because we're going in the same direction and at the same time, and we can benefit from the same service provider. But many times that's not the case. In fact, if you spread that across the 70 different vessels that are operating on any given day, you could have 70 different requests for service. And so then the government is left to decide who's going to get service first. And we have to prioritize those based on, again, need,
Right.
urgency of need, and then where you're located. And so those priorities of service, and I'll just lay these out for you: search and rescue,
Right.
urgent vessel assistance, community service requests, and then navigation or facilitate navigation requests. Now, those four priorities. If a vessel calls out and says, I need your help today, and I've got an abundance of icebreakers and I got low coverage of ice, and I can assign that on a case-by-case basis, we don't have to go through priorities. They just first call, first gets assistance. And that's generally how we lay them out.
Right.
If I have multiple requests for assistance, I'm going to go through that list of priorities. And let's say you just need to go from point A to point B. Is it urgent? Are you in danger? Is the ship in a field of ice and drifting and can't get out? That would be an urgent request.
Right.
Am I a passenger vessel and I'm swept up by ice and I can't get to my pier, and my crew or my ship full of people is in danger? That might rise to the level of a search and rescue request. Or maybe, God forbid, but maybe there's a plane crash out over the open ice, or there's a spill and we got to go out and do that. So based on priority, we're going to shuffle our resources to attend to the most urgent of those needs. And then when it comes to facilitating navigation, which is about 90% of what we do on a daily basis, we don't get a lot of search and rescue cases. In fact, we average 1 or 2 a season.
Sure.
We don't get a lot of urgent vessel assistance requests, 1 or 2 a season. Community service requests. Ferry, right? My ferry can't get to the island because it's blocked by ice. Well, if I'm at home on an island, occasionally I may incur some challenges or some interruption of my daily life because I chose to live on an island.
Yep.
But if an island is blocked long enough, they run out of food, they run out of food sources, they run out of propane, fuel, gasoline. This is going to tick them up in that priority list. So I live on an island and I can't get to work today. Okay, we're going to work you into the process, but it's not really going to be urgent. We're going to treat you just like, because when you come off the island, you pay your ferry for your service. So it's a reasonable demand of commerce. It's commerce. So based on that urgency, we'll decide. Now, flooding. If a community is at risk of flooding caused by ice, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is charged with managing inland flooding. And if they come to the Coast Guard and they say, hey, this is important, this is going to be a danger of life and property, then we're going to rank that priority of service. Right. But if you're just moving to point A to point B, look, if you're alongside a dock and I got another ship that's competing for ice-breaking resources and they're underway actually trapped in ice and can't move, you're safe where you're at. I'm probably going to put my attention to the one who's at higher risk and then delay your departure, say 6, 8, 12 hours so we can get things moving. Delays are painful to industry, right? Because time is money. So we don't necessarily like that. But what I will tell you is, go back 30, 40 years, it was a free-for-all. Right? Everybody just sailed out into the abyss. We didn't have good weather forecasting. We didn't have good ice prediction. We didn't have anybody managing ice-breaking resources. It was basically, hey, I went out, I got stuck, and I went, oh, Coast Guard, I need help. And the Coast Guard, not having enough resources, inevitably left people out there, and they weren't able to get assistance in the timely nature.
Right.
So what we have developed over time through lessons learned, some hard lessons learned, and we've developed this priority of service. So we've asked industry. They come to us on a daily basis and they tell us which of the ships are moving, where are they going, and when do they want to be there?
Right.
Where do they expect to want icebreaking services? This information is exchanged at least daily, sometimes depending on the span of operations or the tempo of operations, we may come 2, 3, 4 times a day with updates. When we have major waterway obstruction, we may be doing 2 or 3 conference calls with industry. And when I say industry, every company that's operating on the Great Lakes comes together and we formulate a plan together. It's a collective management plan. During the summer months, if you're a company and I'm a company, we're competing with one another for business. During the winter months, we ask everyone to put aside that competition and come together to communicate on behalf of the collective good, because they don't have enough resources to move on their own. We don't have enough resources to move individual vessels on their own, and so we have to have a collective effort. And so through the years, we've developed this process by which we plan and then we execute that plan based on feedback that we receive from commercial industry and the public. And then everyone, we try our best to lay out a service plan. Now, not all 70 vessels get what they want when they want it. Mm-hmm. We go into that with that statement. There's just no way that we can entertain that. We also ask during the peak of the winter season for vessels to consider their horsepower and the length and the value of the cargo they're trying to move, right? If I'm taking a load of salt water from point A to point B, and I'm going to demand some resources, we ask them, hey, let's at least have enough horsepower to go out into the conditions that you're asking to go in. Now, I'm not saying you're not going to get stuck, but at least don't take a 400 horsepower tug and try and push a barge full of salt water across this particular waterway, right?
Right.
So individual captain of the ports will dictate parameters for when vessels and what characteristics they have to move. And then that's kind of how we levy that out. Now, go back over the point of the conversation. That's a lot of information to observe. And so go back to the question. How do you decide who moves when and how many get to go? That's all based on priority of service and where you're located in the waterway and that predictability of the system. Mm-hmm. Make sense?
Yep, absolutely, yes. I was kind of wondering, if they ever thought of the convoy system where everybody gets in line and follows the icebreaker through the area, so that way you're only doing one track versus having to do multiple tracks to get.
So convoys, that's an interesting word, right? So we call convoys the C word in the industry. Look, there are some very powerful vessels on the Great Lakes. And there are a few that really don't need a whole lot of icebreaking assistance. And then there's a number of vessels that aren't as powerful and they require help.
Yeah.
And so on occasion, when the waterway is restricted and we have some challenges, we will ask more powerful vessels to hold back and wait for less powerful vessels, and we move them, as you say, in groupings.
Okay.
Now, typically, we like to keep people moving first in, first to move, right? That's kind of the rule. If we close the waterway to low visibility, the first vessel that's stopped will generally be the first person to start again. And that's just fair, right?
Yeah.
But when we have conditions that dictate that not everybody can go on their own merits, we will typically, or we will occasionally ask for powerful vessels. I could be the most powerful ship on the Great Lakes, but maybe my hull shape isn't so good in ice.
Yeah.
So maybe I go second or third in line instead of first in line. Mm-hmm. Maybe a tug barge, or what we call articulated tug barges, those are the ones that are rigidly connected. Maybe they go back further in the line. Maybe today's ice conditions mean I only move 2 vessels at a time. And so maybe it's, the first and a strong one and a weak one. Mm-hmm. Or maybe we take 2 strong ones and a weak one. Or maybe we sandwich a strong, a weak, and a strong, and they move collectively. So different conditions dictate different policy and procedure, but they're all in the playbook. Go back to 2014. I talked about that being a generational event. At one point in the early spring, let's say the 1st of April that year, there were 90 vessels waiting to move through the St. Mary's River. We had vessels that were anchored and stopped in ice from here all the way out to Montreal. They were just, there was no way to go. Lake Superior was 90% plus covered with ice. We had a limited amount of ice-breaking resources. The St. Mary's River wasn't cooperating. And so basically we were sequencing vessels 4 and 5 at a time from as far away as Montreal.
Sure.
We didn't have enough pilots. So we had too many vessels, not enough pilots. And so vessels were stopping. Vessels were stopping, they still burn fuel while they're sitting.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
even though they're not moving. So we had to figure out a way to how to replenish them. How did we buy food? How did we get gasoline or fuel? How did we get pilots moved around? So that whole event and that complexity of procession or movement gave us a whole different set of policies. And look, we've been doing this for, go all the way back to the 1930s. So you had, 80 plus years of historical knowledge. But that particular event presented a circumstance that was unlike anything that we faced before. And
Sure.
so, like every year, we learn something different and we modify policy and procedure. The key to success is communicate with our customers, that being industry, that being the general public. We share the information and the lessons learned as we tweak our policy and procedures so that they have a role in helping us formulate that policy. If I do it in the vacuum and I don't tell anybody anything, then there's no predictability.
Right.
And without predictability, that's when the mariners get anxious. And when they get anxious, then we start to have some challenges.
Sure.
And so it's all about transparency of thought, transparency of policy and procedure, and then cooperation when it comes time to move.
Sure. Now, you mentioned earlier about some of the areas that you take care of and try and keep the ice free. Now, getting more into there, we understand that there's a couple titles that you list these different programs, and it's like coal shovel and taconite. Could you explain that a little bit? Maybe a little deeper. Why they?
Sure. Organizationally, we have split the Great Lakes in half. So the demarcation or the split line is midway in Lake Huron. So if you know where Alpena, Michigan is,
Sure.
and you draw a line to the east over to the Canada and Georgian Bay. Georgian Bay in its entirety and everything north of Alpena, Lake Michigan, Lake Superior is managed out of Sault Ste. Marie.
Okay.
Everything south and east of that line is managed cooperatively by the Coast Guard in Detroit and the Canadian Coast Guard that works out of Montreal. Now, I will tell you that the Canadian Coast Guard runs ice-breaking operations year-round. During the summer months, while we're in open water season here, they are managing ice-breaking up in the Arctic. Much of the Arctic is Canadian property, and so they manage the ice-breaking activity up in the Arctic during the summer months. They usually secure that operation when it starts to get cold up there, late October, mid-November. They take a little break, and then that same team of traffic management experts and ice-breaking experts reconstitute and then apply their attention here to the Great Lakes. So in Montreal, the Regional Operations Center run by the Canadian Coast Guard, they are the subject matter experts for ice breaking. Our office in Detroit and then our office in Sault Ste. Marie, we add local expertise and then we cooperatively manage. Remember, Canadian Coast Guard has assets, we have assets, and we combine without any reference to flag state. So if the U.S. waters of the Detroit River are jammed up with ice, we're going to take the largest and most capable icebreakers, whether it's Canadian or U.S., and we're going to put attention into that. Remember, we want the government's biggest resources in the highway, which is the tier ones. And then maybe we take some of our smaller resources, U.S. has more of those, and maybe we keep the Canadians heavier resources in the interstate, and then we'll move smaller resources into smaller waterways, the tier threes and maybe some tier two work. So it's all about putting the most capable resources in the most needy waterways. So regionally, you're split in half. Now, 20 years ago, we had 4 regions, actually 5 when you include the Canadians, and we were all competing for resources. Buffalo ran what was called Operation Breadbasket. It was very short-lived, and it was for all the saltwater vessels, foreign flag vessels that were carrying grain out of the Great Lakes in the fall. Coal Shovel was named for the coal shuttles that used to run back and forth across Lake Erie back in the 60s and 70s. Now, we've since revised our power production grid. We don't use coal as much anymore, but the name stuck. Mm-hmm. And again, the names are attributed to the commodity that was principally supplied by the operation.
Okay.
Out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, we had Oil Can. And Operation Oil Can was principally supporting the refined fuel products that were coming out of Chicago and were shipped all around the Great Lakes. And then Operation Taconite, which was named, taconite is another name for iron ore. Mm-hmm. Taconite was the name that was given to Lake Superior and the St. Mary's River in that operation. Now, over time, we've absorbed these operations, and we've kind of created a playing field of 2 rather than 5. And so the Canadian Coast Guard partners with the Detroit operations under the title of Coal Shovel, and they manage the east side of the Great Lakes.
Sure.
The Canadian Coast Guard partners with the Coast Guard up here in Sault Ste. Marie, and we manage the western lakes under the title of Operation Taconite.
Okay.
So when you hear those names, that's kind of the name synonymous to those operations. There's been some efforts in the past. Do we drop the names because the cargoes really aren't relevant anymore? And so we were trying to get to Ice East and Ice West, and we played around with different things. But if you know anything about Great Lakes shipping, folks, they really like their history. And so it's really tough to move away from some of these historic names.
Yeah.
And so Coal Shovel and Taconite have kind of stuck, and so that's where we're at.
Sure. Now, getting more into the forecasting side, weather forecasting, the National Weather Service in Cleveland has been tasked with issuing the freeze-up outlooks, which are they usually begin right around the first week of November, and then they continue on through till significant ice forms. And then we also issue what we call the breakup outlook in the first week of March. Now, and then also once the ice does form, then we start issuing Monday, Wednesday, and Friday the ice forecast. Now, how do you use this information as part of your operations?
So let's go with the outlooks first.
Okay.
Right? So the freeze up and the breakup, very important for us to see down schedule, plan maintenance for our resources, personnel movements, logistics, not just fueling and things like that, but sometimes crew movements or platform movements. So as we transition from soft water into hard water, right, open water into ice, we have a number, the Coast Guards, both U.S. and Canada, we have small boat rescue operations that are in play. These resources don't do well in ice. So when do we downplay or start to pull those assets out of the water? Really, there's no indicator of that. And so the outlook, which tells us, hey, what's the forecast look like not only in the next 10 days, but maybe 30 days out, 60 days out, 90 days out. And that helps us make decisions with regards to those resources. Helicopters, right? Edmund Fitzgerald, we didn't have the helicopter resources that we have now. Yeah. So when that vessel sank and those personnel lost their lives, we didn't have the resources that we have now. We are blessed in the Great Lakes to have helicopters that have de-icing capability, where in the past they had to manually de-ice, which delayed our response. We've had improved communications. All of these pieces of infrastructure are reliant upon forecast. Inside of your freeze up outlooks, you also track what is known as accumulated freezing degree days.
Yes.
Now, it's kind of voodoo science. A lot of folks don't quite understand how freezing degree days work. Here in the Western Great Lakes, we use that calculation. You would know more about the history of heating degree days and freezing degree days, but I will tell you that the calculation of freezing degree days helps us determine when we're going to see the water transition from open, start to make ice, when we can expect ice to start hindering navigation, and when we can expect to see ice start to encumber ports and riverine environments, and then eventually open water environments. Through history, we've made some decisions based on your forecasts, and we've set certain landmarks. So when we achieve this number, we're going to stop this type of behavior. Maybe this particular platform, a tug towing a barge behind, they don't do well in ice. So at a certain freezing degree day count, we may recommend that those folks don't move in that configuration. Maybe they put the barge on the front of the tug. Maybe they add extra tugs to facilitate movement. At certain points, when the freezing degree days get to certain amounts, we'll actually tell some of the more capable vessels to reroute and avoid certain waterways, so that we don't do damage to the waterway, so that when all the ice melts, the bottom of the channels got damaged, and then you got to dredge and do cleanup operations there. That's one component. But the breakup forecast helps us decide when things are going to wind down. Your weekly culmination of ice coverage. Look, we talked about this earlier. There's a half a dozen, 6 to 8 entities that are providing input, and it collectively comes together to help decision makers, not our decision makers, but the collective decision makers. Satellite imagery, forecasted data, wind events, live reporting. Many people don't know that ships are making reports not only to the Coast Guard, but to the Weather Service. They're transmitting data. We used to do it all over fax. Now we all via the internet. So sometimes some people, we've got apps on our phone, and we can plug in weather data into the app, and you can feed the machine. You have a number of computer modeling that determines, based on all of that input, what we can expect to see. And as we learn and get smarter, the computers learn and get smarter, our forecasting gets better, and then we get to make decisions. So that, go back to 1975, had we had the forecasting system and the ability to see what was going to happen in the next 72 hours, maybe the Edmund Fitzgerald doesn't sail. Maybe they wait in Duluth 2 days, let that storm subside, and then they venture out. Maybe they decide not to take so much cargo. So maybe they're not loaded as heavy. Maybe they look at the water level in the St. Mary's River and they say, you know what, we're not going to have enough under keel clearance, so we load less, which makes us a little bit more uneasy out in the open water. But, you know, what I'm saying is we have so many more predictive tools that we don't have to put ourselves at risk as much as we once did.
Right.
Eventually, you know, maybe down the road, 10, 20, 30 years ago, 30 years from now, maybe we have so much great tools that we don't have to make the risky decisions that we do now. But for now, this is what we've got. Your tools, your forecasting, your modeling, combined with the other entities that provide input, are all used. They're all collated and all used and exchanged with the mariner, so that we can collectively make the safest and most predictable route decisions on each move.
Sure. Now, you've been talking all along with this discussion about, you know, all these discussions that you have with the different entities. Now, I guess they call it like a daily ice brief. And is this these forecasts that we issue, are they included as part of that brief?
Yeah. So in the beginning, the first thing we start with in each on each brief. Now, sometimes the briefs are daily when that tempo is high. Sometimes twice daily. When the tempo is low or ice coverage is low, maybe we're doing the calls 3 times a week or once a week. So the tempo of calls varies, but the information exchanged is typically in a similar format. we collate and we provide what is called a weather and ice summary. And so there's a collective briefing, and it can be handed out electronically. So the various companies, look, the conference calls are limited. You can't put everybody in the world on the call at the same time
Right.
because the infrastructure is limited. But what we can do is share that, and we post that to various websites so that if I am the captain of ship, 123, and you're the captain of ship 456, you don't have to wait for the call. You can log on to these various websites, these portals, and you can pull that information down. Inside that, sometimes we'll have satellite imagery. Sometimes we'll have actual pictures. When we fly our aircraft to do observations, when we put individual ice operations. But at the very least, you'll have a synopsis of today's weather and tomorrow's weather, today's conditions and what we think is going to happen tomorrow, and then generally the layout of what our resources are planning to do today and tomorrow, so that you, the customer, can look at that and make decisions.
Sure.
Right? It's all about risk-based decision making. Do I want to sail today? Well, if I know the weather's clearing 2 days out, I know it's going to be bad at my ultimate destination. Maybe I start my journey, but then find a place to stop and wait.
Sure.
And all of that. Most of the Great Lakes, they're on a 4 or 5 day transit window. If I'm taking iron ore to Chicago, I leave Western Lake Superior. It's roughly a day and a half, 2 day transit. I discharge, and it's roughly a day and a half, 2 days to get back. And so there you have, a 5 day transit window. If I'm going to, say, Detroit from Western Superior, or I'm going from Erie, Pennsylvania to Western Lake Superior, or Erie, Pennsylvania to Chicago, these are all transit routes that have a predictable time frame. And most of the ships are operating on a cycle or a schedule. And so there's a certain amount of predictability just in their routines. And so add in the weather and ice condition forecasting and reports, they can make decisions without having to consult us.
Sure.
The more informed the mariner is, the more safe and the more efficient their movement becomes. Instead of me telling them how to behave, they can make decisions for themselves. We want a compliant and free-moving waterway system. I don't want everybody waiting to have somebody else make a decision. I want people to be able to take information, collate, and make rational decisions. And then we deal with maybe the 10% of the population that run into some trouble. If you think about it on a holistic basis, if you could have 90% of your community or customers moving free flow, and you're only spending your time with 10%, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good business model.
Sure.
If I'm spending 90% of my time on just 10% of my movement, then I'm not doing a good job. But if I'm spending 10% on 90% of my community, I'm doing pretty good.
That's right.
So that's kind of applying some business modeling. Look, we're not perfect. No one pretends to be perfect. None of this is foolproof, right?
Right.
There's always a certain element of unpredictability.
Sure.
But the idea is to use all the tools and drive down that unpredictability so that we make the most logical and safe decision with the information that we have at the time.
Okay.
None of this happens in a vacuum.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. So, in our forecast, sometimes we do mention the potential for ice flows shifting or tracks closing because of gusty winds. And I was just wondering, what do the shipmasters, do they say, hey, we're going to wait it out till the winds die down so they don't get stuck, or do they just try and venture into the track and hope they don't get stuck?
No one operating in the Great Lakes, and I would venture to say driving ships around the world, intentionally drives into harm's way.
Okay.
It's just not what they do.
Sure.
They're very cognizant of the weather. They are very cognizant of the fact that the conditions around them are presenting risk. That said, they're also business people, right? And they also have a business to run. And so there is that conflict of risk reward.
Sure.
Right? Do I take a risk for the benefit of reward? And so you always have that out there. We have that in the government, right? Do I send my asset out into this event? What's the risk to the crew, to the platform? What's the chance of success in accomplishing what we're trying to get to?
Sure.
So there's risk reward decisions being made all over the place. Our process for evaluating risk is improved exponentially over the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So those advisories that didn't exist 20 years ago, right? We didn't have, we basically had a near shore forecast and we took a stab at open water. We called the old marine forecasts or MAFORs, right? And the MAFORs were good for about 12 to 24 hours. Beyond that, we kind of knew what was going to happen, but you're basically, looking at a 30% reliability rate.
Sure.
We flipped that on its ear, right? So our 36 to 72 hour outlook, pretty close to being pretty accurate, right?
Good.
Occasionally you get some bend, but we're pretty good out to 72 hours.
Right.
We're better out to 7 days, and we're improving out to 30 days.
Right.
Beyond the 10-day forecast, I don't put a lot of stock into that as an operator. As a ship driver, I'm probably not putting a lot of stock into that. It can help me kind of lay out a plan.
Sure.
But generally speaking, we're going to think in 3-day cycles.
Right. Yeah.
So that's what they're applying. But those broadcasts, those urgent marine broadcasts that go out that talk about pressure warnings or freeze and spray warnings, right? Freeze and spray. People don't think about that. But as I sail out, water comes out and freezes, and then freezes to the hull or the extremities of these ships. It adds weight, right? So when the ice freezes to the wire rope, or it freezes to the antenna, or it freezes to the masthead, all of that stuff collects ice, and then as it thickens, it adds weight.
Sure.
And eventually, what happens is I get too much weight on the top side, and I don't have enough weight on the bottom side, and then I become unstable. And what we don't want is ships getting out there and getting unstable and flipping over and cracking apart and doing that, which is eventually what can happen with too much topside icing.
Right.
So those freeze and spray warnings, very important.
Okay.
Mariners will take different routes to avoid or take the cover of land, right? If I have a strong northerly wind, I may not go to the southern shoreline. I may tuck up on the north shoreline and hide and get what we call the lee, or the protection of land.
Right.
If I have a strong southerly breeze, I may take to the southern shoreline. Typically during freeze and spray warnings, I don't want to take waves on the bow, because on the front of the boat, because that's going to bring spray and cause things. So all those factors, again, think of just the variables we're talking about, which is maybe a dozen. They're entertaining and evaluating 10 times that many variables.
Sure.
Because not only the exterior and the environment, they're balancing the interior, the crew, all the things that go into moving from point A to point B.
Sure.
And there is a myriad of calculations that are made.
Mm-hmm.
So in this environment, right, shipping is the most environmentally friendly. It's the most economically sound way to move these bulk cargoes, right? If it wasn't, we would have figured out how to move them by some other means, right? Trains. If you start adding train cars, let's think, take a 1,000-foot ship. You can take 7 100-car train loads of cargo, one ship, and moves that much.
Wow.
Right? So think of the diesel smoke that's going outside of one train pulling 100 cars.
Yeah.
Times that by 7, and that's what you replace with one ship movement.
Right.
So when it comes to the environment, shipping is as environmentally friendly as they can be. We're constantly improving the efficiency of our engines. We're cleaning the exhaust. We're scrubbing, right? So some ships have adopted these scrubbing systems where there's 0 emissions coming out of that stack, right? They replace and clean, and then what you see coming out of the stack is just steam water.
Right.
It's hot air that's gone through that cleaning process. So decades ago, not even decades ago, go 10 years ago, right? Our efficiency, think about the car and the miles per hour or miles per gallon we get. The efficiencies of the engine. All of this is, no one wants dirty air and dirty water. We all want to be clean in our environment. And so they're all taking incremental steps to try and improve their efficiency. Efficiency in the economy, efficiency in the environment, the efficiency in their operations.
Sure.
And so, again, that's kind of the balance. I know we went off track there, but that's kind of where
No,
we're
that's
at.
fine. But we talk about the Sioux locks, and that plays a critical player in the whole ice forecasting and the movement of ships through the Great Lakes. And typically, towards like the middle of January, the Sioux locks shut down. And what's the reason for shutting that down? And how does we talked about the impacts, but what do they do?
Yeah, so here's the history behind the locks, right? So to get from Lake Superior to the lower end or the river environment, there's a 21-foot elevation change. Sault Ste. Marie, the city, both on the U.S. and the Canadian side, that's French for the Rapids of St. Mary's River. So Sault Ste. Marie is the location where the rapids. Now, go back into the early settlement, 1700s, right? The only way you could get down was you either rode the rapids or you stopped on the upper end of the rapids, unloaded your cargo, and you moved it around and put it on another ship, and you moved it on the lower end of the car. Very tedious and very economically unfriendly. So through the course of history, we have built lock chambers, right? And using hydraulics, we can lift ships up and down, and that's basically what we've come to. At the Soo locks, there are two canals. You have the South Canal and the North Canal. There are 4 separate locks. You have the MacArthur lock, you have the Poe lock, you have the Davis lock, and then you have the Sabin lock. Those are the names of the individual locks. Currently, the South Canal is the only one that is active. The North Canal is closed. I'll talk about construction in a minute. But the South Canal becomes the only way through to get from Lake Superior down to the lower river and the rest of the lakes. The MacArthur lock was built in 1943. The Poe lock was built in 1968. They're both old, right? And I don't mean to demean old, I'm old, right? But what I'll tell you is these platforms are respectively, and I won't do math in public, but 43 to present and 68 to present, they're both greater than 50 years old. Mm-hmm. The hydraulic parts inside are simple, but they are affected by climate and year-round use.
Okay.
And so the period of maintenance in the winter, go back to, we were talking about the winter navigation experiment, the year-round in the 70s, 1974 to 78, we experimented with trying to operate the locks year-round. And what we learned is the hydraulics and the equipment don't work well in ultra-cold weather. And so the Corps of Engineers chose 15 January, really 16 January to 24 March to shut down, because that's the most unfriendly in weather during those time frames.
Sure.
And they use that to conduct what they call winter maintenance. And so depending on their work schedule, they will dewater their locks, and they will send personnel down in, and they will take pumps out and retune the pumps. They will replace seals and bunkering and fendering systems. Sometimes they'll change out the hydraulic rams on the gates. They'll change out electrical cabling. So each year, and you can imagine the infrastructure, as old as it is, requires, as older it gets, the more attention it needs.
Sure.
And so that's the period of work. So they basically will close the locks down, and then they will spend that 9-week period, 16 January to 24 March. Similarly, the Welland Canal and the St. Lawrence Seaway. The Welland Canal has 8 locks in their system. The St. Lawrence Seaway has 7 locks. And so what we're doing up here with just 2 locks, they're doing times 8 and times 7 over there. Their periods of work are a little bit fluctuated based on weather. They have some flexibility in their schedule. Go back to the U.S. and our commitment to predictability. When we came out of the winter year-round and navigation experiment, what we decided was a fixed period for winter maintenance. Now, while the Corps is doing that maintenance, that means no one can come and go in Lake Superior. So 7 out of 10 ships that come through the locks during the year are carrying some form of iron ore. While the locks are closed, that means that iron ore is not moving. Grain not moving. Now, practically, think about this. Iron ore, coal, limestone, even grain, these cargoes have water in their chemical makeup. We call them aqueous cargo. And with water in their makeup, when the air temperature freezes, they don't move so well. If you think of a frozen block of rocks, right? Multiply that by tons. Sometimes when it's really silly cold, and I'm talking about silly cold, where you get days on end where you don't get higher than zero.
Right.
In order to get that cargo out of the cargo hold, they literally got to go in there and jackhammer it out.
Oh, wow.
And it becomes labor intensive and dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Because who's the poor person that's got to go in there and jackhammer it out,
Yeah.
right? So we learned all those lessons, right? It's hard on the equipment. It's hard on our personnel. So it just makes sense to shut down for a certain period of time.
Okay.
And so that's the period of lock closure.
Gotcha.
Go back to the seasonality. Ice begins to form mid-December. From that time period until lock closure, 15 January, that's the extended navigation season. It usually takes industry 9 to 10 months of the year of trading in order to break even for the year, financially.
Wow.
That extra 4 or 5 weeks they get at the end of December into January, and that extra 4 or 5 weeks they get from the time the locks open in March to the time ice goes away, that's their profit margin. If we got a lot of ice and they're not able to make a lot of trips, not a lot of profit margin.
Right.
Around the Great Lakes, all of your facilities, if anybody grew up in the Great Lakes and remembers 60s, 70s, and early 80s, there used to be piles of coal, piles of iron ore, piles of salt laying all over the place. It was ugly. It was also very environmentally unfriendly, right? Wind blows, the dust from the coal goes in the water. Wind blows, and the oil that comes off of the iron ore would roll out into the water. Salt blowing around in the water. Fresh water, guess what? We're drinking that fresh water. Do we want that in our water? No. And so the governments, US and Canada, decided that maybe it wasn't really smart to have that stuff laying around the Great Lakes. And we changed our tax code that made it counterproductive for these companies to keep stockpiles. And so we created a just-in-time delivery system. And so most of these facilities keep enough cargo to operate for generally two transit cycles. Remember, a transit cycle is 4 to 5 days. So they usually keep about maybe 8 to 10 days worth of cargo around to keep their blast furnace or keep their facility operating. Towards the end of the season, they'll add a little bit to that to give them 8 weeks worth of material to operate in while the locks are closed. So one of the questions that comes to me often is, why is there such an urgency to move in the spring? Why don't you just wait till everything thaws? That's the urgency. All of the facilities around the Great Lakes, remember, 55% of the regional economy relies on the movement of cargo in the Great Lakes.
Gotcha.
Imagine, not just car parts, but Westinghouse, Amana, GE, all of the appliances that rely on the metal, right, that go into that. Think about your food, your road. Where you go to the hardware store and buy a bag of salt, that's moved on the Great Lakes, right? That bag of salt comes from a half a dozen facilities on the Great Lakes and then is trucked or railed around the country to places that use road salt. The salt that we put on our food, Morton's terminals, here on the Great Lakes, that salt comes out of the ground, gets moved, processed, and then redistributed. So all of that stuff that has been laying dormant for 8 weeks while the locks are closed, total of 9, they have to wake back up again. And we do that with that cargo in the spring. So that's why there's an urgency to move in the spring.
Okay.
What moves when the locks are closed? Well, you can't move in Lake Superior because the locks are closed, right? So none of that commodity is moving. St. Lawrence Seaway and the Welland Canal are moved, so nobody's coming in and out of the ocean. So Lake Erie, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan become a closed loop system. And so maybe the Erie facility has extra iron ore, and they sell it to the Chicago facility. And so a ship will move iron ore from the port of Erie to the port of Chicago. The salt that goes to the various places comes out of the ground in a facility in Goderich, Ontario. If you're familiar with Michigan and you know where the thumb of Michigan is. If you go due east from the thumb, Goderich is a small mining town there.
Okay.
That salt, that mine, is owned by a U.S. company called Compass Minerals. Salt comes out of the ground. It gets distributed based on quality. Some of it goes to seasoning salt. Others go to road salt. But it's distributed around the Great Lakes. Fuel, gasoline, diesel, airplane fuel, heating oil, all of those things, some move by pipeline. A large portion of that moves by tank ship.
Okay.
And so we still need gas at our pumps. We still need the heating oil, propane, to heat our homes.
Sure.
So that stuff is still moving around even though the locks are closed. And so you remember we talked about priority of service and we talked about waterway designations. The cargo priority also factors into that decision-making process. If we have a really snowy winter, there's going to be a high demand for salt. And so there's an urgency for that salt to move.
Sure.
Is it as urgent as iron ore? Well, if I have an island community that's flooding and I have a ship that's moving iron ore, rocks are going to wait behind people.
Yeah.
So that goes back to that shift of priority and who gets resources when.
Sure.
Now, level of activity, while the locks are closed, maybe you're down to maybe 24 vessels on the Great Lakes. It's not the 60 or 70 we were talking about before. But the environment that they're moving through is so severe that the level of attention and the level of effort to move from point A to point B is exponentially increased. And so what normally would take 20 hours to go from point A to point B may take 2 days.
Right.
It may take 3 days with 3 different icebreakers. Mm-hmm. And so one icebreaker does one segment. We get to open water, they transit, they get to the ice field. We work on them a couple of days, we get them to open water, and then we move them on. And then they discharge, and then they come back. And then they come back empty, right? Empty, not as efficient through ice as loaded. Because I have more ship out of the water. When I'm loaded, I have more ship. Gives me more punch. So all of those factors go into movement, and thus the seasonality of what's happening around in the Great Lakes.
Right. Well, one of our viewers asked a question on the Lake Erie. Typically, we have people that live out on the islands, and they were wondering, do the icebreakers help out in keeping a channel open so that the ferries can keep running all year long?
So certain communities don't want us in there, right? They want their ice. Recreational ice use is an industry on the Great Lakes. There are people who make their living guiding people for commercial fishing, for recreational fishing on ice. Mm-hmm. You have snowmobile events. You have they have sailboats with skis. You have hockey tournaments. You have all manner of activity that occur on ice. And so what we don't want to do is have a conflict between ice breaking for commercial and then inadvertent ice breaking that endangers island residents.
Sure.
And so through the course of history, we have identified certain areas. We know where all the ferry routes are. We work with some ferries actually lay up for the winter, and then they will run either hovercraft or run airboats. We have up here in this Lake Superior, we have a ferry that works with one of the islands. It's actually a power-driven airboat where it's up on the ice. It's not quite a hovercraft, but it travels on the ice, transporting people to and from their island community.
Okay.
We have some areas where they create what's called ice bridges. And people actually will traverse, they'll drive vehicles, they'll drive four-wheelers, they'll drive snow machines to and from the island. And those ice bridges have been used for generations. What we don't want is we don't want an ice bridge and then have an icebreaker go down the middle of it and have people either get in the ice accidentally or worse, find it by accident when the icebreaker's not there.
Right.
And so we have created what we call safety zones.
Okay.
Or regulated navigation areas. And these areas are put around these island communities, A, to protect the residents, but B, to protect the field of ice that's around them so that there isn't accidental interference.
Right.
Now, many of these island communities have ice-strengthened ferries, and so they keep their own track. And so they will carve a track and maintain a track through the ice, and then ice is everywhere around them.
Sure.
What they don't want is some commercial mariner to go plying through there to weaken the ice on the outside, which damages the track on the inside.
Right.
And so that is back on us. Remember, island community support. One of our priorities is providing safety for those known recreational use areas.
Sure.
Now, there's a delicate balance, right? If you go and you entertain any kind of study about recreational ice use, you'll come to know that as soon as they can stand on it, they will play on it, right? And I don't mean any disrespect to anybody that's venturing out on ice. They're doing it for hundreds of years. People make their livelihood. They feed off of it. They recreate on it. But again, we want to know about these activities. If we're going to place an area, let's say we have an area that we haven't visited in several weeks, and we're going to send an icebreaker into an area. We want to alert the public that there's an icebreaker coming, so that if I have ventured my ice shanty out a little further from the shoreline because the fish are really good in this location, but I also am dangerously close to a shipping channel that hasn't been touched in a couple of weeks. So we will put out at least 3 days warning. We will put out what we call a broadcast. We will issue press releases, and we will alert general folks in an area, hey, we're getting ready to send an icebreaker over here. Remember, commercial shipping doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's a schedule. We know we want to go to this area. We rely on the reports of that area, the broadcast, the forecasts, and the information about areas so that we don't blindly send an icebreaker into an area and cause people harm.
Right.
And so, again, everything's about predictability, whether it's the recreational public or whether it's the commercial navigator.
Sure.
The more information that's available, the better people's understanding, the better the outcome will be.
Sure. Right. Well, Mark, that's pretty much all the questions I have. Do you have any other information that I haven't asked about that you want to share with our viewers before we close?
No, looking back over everything that we discussed, I think we've covered the area. I would say this, I know you're going to post this. If there are questions that are generated by the posting, people got questions, we're all about answering those questions.
Okay.
So as you get those and you want to bring them to us, we're an open book.
Okay.
Again, what we do for Western Great Lakes is mirrored out of Detroit for the Eastern Great Lakes. You may know my counterpart down there is Miss Tracy Gerard.
Yes, yes.
So Tracy has got my role down there. So she and her partners at the Regional Operations Center in Montreal, collectively the three entities are managing domestic icebreaking on the Great Lakes. We follow the same rules and policies. Canadian rules are a little bit different. Their priorities are surface. There's a couple of variances, but when we are working in their waters, we apply our rules in their waters. When they work on our waters, they apply their rules in our waters. So it's not so different that we can't get along.
Sure.
But there's some nuances, and that goes to part of the feedback and the constructive exchange of ideas.
Right, right.
We'd love to be able to behave the same, but again, out of respect, they're a completely different country. And so they have their own rules and regulations as we do. And so it's not one set of rules applies to all, but we're pretty close in how we behave.
Okay.
So I wish you continued success. I thank you for reaching out to me. I am honored that you thought to ask me to do this presentation. We provided a pictorial that you're going to kind of link. So some of the things that we exchanged and talked about today, hopefully the pictorial adds some benefit to those that are watching. And again, encourage questions.
Sure.
So if you ask Kirk, send Kirk questions. He'll relay them to me, and we'll do our best to try and get answers in a timely manner.
Okay, once again, I thank you very much for your time, and this is very enlightening for me. I've been doing this for, 20-something years now, and I've actually learned some as well. So, once again, thank you.
No, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity.
Sure.
Take care.